Right. Hi, everybody. Uh, we have a couple of things on the agenda. So if you have new topics on the agenda, now is a good time to add under the future section. Should we go through based on the sequence? So is there any release block we should be discussed? Okay, thanks for that comment, Evan. I'll add for you to the end of the queue. All right, let's go ahead. Start with our first topic, which is multi-network ambient. Keith, you are here, right?
Yes, I'm here. Would you like me to share my screen?
Actually, yes, that would be good. I was just sharing my screen for the agenda. Please take it away.
Oh, sure. Okay, let me. Okay, this might get sort of ugly for a little bit. I'm just trying to share a specific window. Google, why won't you let me just share a specific window? Here we go. Let's see if that worked. That did not work. Holy cow.
Well, at least we didn't see anything. So.
Oh, I saw this giant banner of like you were sharing the screen.
But nothing confidential from your screen. That's what I meant.
Okay, good. Don't want the lawyers getting on to me. Let's try this. Okay, looks like that worked. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. All right. So I think this is the first time I've walked through this doc in this meeting in the new year. So just briefly refreshing context for this doc specifically. So we already have an approved design doc for the ambient multi-network protocol and how that communication is going to work with double H-bone. This doc handles the control plane and service discovery aspects of it. The feedback that I got before sort of the holiday break in the new year was to have to kind of sort of elaborate more on what information is being read from remote control planes. Remote API servers. And here we to discuss that here. Some of this is outdated, unfortunately. But the thing I want to focus on is here in this control plane implementation section. So what I've sought to try to do is to call out everything that a local Istio needs to know about in order to successfully program proxies for multi-network communication. There is a need to read pods to get service account name for secure naming, maybe labels to handle locality. We also need endpoints, also potential for locality, health checking. We need to know how many endpoints. Our initial implementation is going to follow what we do in sidecars, where we essentially the data plane, the Z-tunnel, or the sidecar or waypoint doesn't see all of the any pod IPs from the remote cluster. Part of the thing with multi-network is that those pod IPs might not be routable. And so instead we'll do some split horizon EDS, and I'll link the code here in the doc that shows the exact algorithm to weight the traffic appropriately for the east-west gateway. So we need to know the endpoint count so that we can do that weighting. We also need to know what pod the endpoint's attached to, so we can get the service account for that endpoint. We of course need services, cluster VIPs, DNS host names. Eventually, the VIPs will be important for single cluster as well, and endpoint pod membership. We'll need to read the gateways from the remote cluster to know what the east-west gateways are. This might not be necessary if we use the remote gateways approach that is linked above here in this PR that Stephen Landau worked on. And then finally, we need to read nodes for the sake of node port services. So that's sort of a rundown of what I found, just looking at what sort of information would be necessary. Does anyone have any questions or comments on this specifically?
Yeah,
John, you've got a hand.
So like today we have a collection that takes in as inputs basically these things and outputs WDS. Will we use that same collection for this? And we just obviously pass in different inputs in terms of different cluster, or would it be a completely different collection logic?
You're talking about like a KRT collection for the single collector case?
Yes.
Good question. I would want to try. I don't want to create a whole new collection. There is some last mile stuff, potentially, like especially with the way we're wanting to represent east-west gateways as workload to the network gateway field set. That we would need to do sort of custom for the multi-network case. But by and large, I'm wanting to reuse most of what we already have for the ambient use case. You'll see even later down the east-west gateway section that I'm wanting the east-west gateways to sort of to be fancy waypoints. So wherever we can use the existing stuff, the better, so that we don't have stuff fall out of sync.
Kit, on the remote gateways, I don't think we have sufficient documentation around them, and it would be great to add more documentation and make it public and kind of expose it. But I think it's very important to have a well-defined mechanism, I mean, kind of the API, what is expected for them with whatever controllers they may be used to create it, because we may have other controllers that create the remote gateway if it's an external gateway. And I would say a kind of a highly desirable thing to be able to operate in without watching other clusters. So if a controller is capable of creating the remote gateways, we should not have to watch other clusters for any purpose if it's possible. And I think it is possible because that's the whole implementation of multi-network. Any objections to that? Or
I don't see how. Go ahead, John.
Many objections.
Okay.
That's not how the multi-network works today, and it's also, I mean, this is what we've been discussing for like 6 months and decided not to do that. So I don't even know really where to begin on the objections.
Objections of not having to watch the remote API servers?
Yeah, like, I mean, what else? I'm just confused. I'm very confused. It's like, we've been discussing this for a very, very long time, and we discussed kind of options at length, and among those was variants of this, and everything has kind of gone in this direction. Like, I'm confused. Obviously, you need some information from a remote cluster. So, like, where would you be getting that from?
What information do you need from the remote clusters? I mean, MCS doesn't actually need to watch the remote clusters.
And MCS requires an external controller that watches remote clusters.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I mean, if an external controller like MCS or something similar exists.
And if you want to do an external controller, you're free to do so. Like, Istio already has APIs that can.
Yes, there is one MCS. I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to say. I mean,
sure,
if MCS is available,
like, feel free to write workload entries or endpoint slices or services, whatever you want to configure a cluster. This is about having it built in so that you don't have to have an external controller to do that.
I'm saying we should not do that. I'm saying that if someone has a controller, and again, people who have MCS, I mean, clusters that have MCS have this controller in place, we should not be required to, I mean, we should not have anything as a design that absolutely require watching the other clusters.
You don't need a design to do that, though. Just do it today. We already have all the extension points.
Yeah, Costin, there may be some missing context here. As we were working through this in late November, early December, we decided not to go the MCS route. I'm not sure if you were present for that meeting.
I know, and I agree. Not going MCS route as requiring MCS or using the MCS API. Saying MCS like controller, implementations that is an external controller that is not requiring each STOD to watch each cluster, but it's some controller that is watching all clusters and is populating stuff in each cluster, so you don't have the permission problems and all the other stuff associated with. Because there are a lot of problems, at least in Google, about one cluster having access to the API server on another cluster for all kind of, and I'm sure we are not the only ones. So this kind of the secrets, all the access permissions, expiration tokens, firewalls, policies, and other stuff may prevent an STOD and a pod in a cluster to have access to another cluster. That's really the bottom line.
Yeah.
I think the objective here. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. So I actually have the same concerns that Costin does. So
happy I'm not crazy.
So Michael was talking to Keith about this, and I've read through a few iterations of this doc and giving feedback on it. Was for this control plane implementation section, rather than trying to prescribe or mandate the how, really trying to focus on what is the data we need, and then finding a way to structure that in terms of like the intermediary layers, so that the how, as long as we have an interface where if we build one implementation, it's possible to build a different implementation of how to get that data. I think that is what I would describe as a design goal. And then what we do with it after we have it is the part that should be consistent, hopefully.
I agree with that generally, but like open source Istio has to ship with something that is usable with batteries included.
Yeah. And I think that's fine for us to have the how as like the similar to the existing secret based read every other SDO. Like, I think that is fine as long as that is a sufficient like interface, rather than having that plumbed all the way through, assuming that that's the only how that's possible.
Yeah, but this is the how, though. We already have the not how. I don't know what the word is for that. Like, Istio is already extensible. You can write workload entries and service entries and endpoints and pods and servers, whatever you want. You can read them through XDS. You can do all sorts of things. This is if you want to just work without having your own extension that does that. This is the how Istio natively does it. So I'm a bit confused. We don't need anything else for an extension to do it. There's plenty of extensions that build on top of Istio today. Like Costin has one that's console.
MCP.
Yeah.
To clarify, John, we have more than enough extensions. I'm not saying we don't have enough extensions. What we don't have standards and APIs that are kind of, we have basically implementations that happen to leak abstractions. The reason I mentioned remote gateway, if we document it, which is very reasonable since it's a feature we have and it's very useful, and we require that STOD, when it's watching remote clusters, create and construct those gateways as an API, basically, then we can have basically this one as a kind of a baseline of how any controllers that may do the same thing integrate. So STOD can watch for the remote gateways. I think it does today, and can create them if it's configured to do so. So can act as a controller that created. So that will become the API surface that we define for anyone who implements this kind of mechanisms to discover the remote class or to configure manually, because that's perfectly fine. They can do it. I mean, they use CI/CD, they use whatever, shell scripts or other controllers.
My question is why? Sorry to jump ahead a little bit, but I want to tug at that a little bit, Costin. Why does Istio as an OSS project need to prescribe what custom controllers write?
Because it is not possible always to have an STOD connect securely to all the other clusters. Right now, what we do is an atrocity in terms of security.
No, but we're not saying that, Costin. We're saying that we have extension points and you can use them how you want. Why? It sounds like what Keith at least is interpreting you saying is that you're saying I want to be prescribed how to use the extension points. And the documentation one that you mentioned, like, sure, like I agree, obviously docs can be better, and I don't think anyone objects to docs being better. But I don't think that's a critical thing.
Because you may know the one way, I know another way. There are 10 different ways to do the same thing, and most of them are internals that are not guaranteed to work. So if we don't say, hey, if you cannot use remote access to another cluster, do this, and we test that works, and Istio can also watch that thing, because again, the workload entry is not real. It's a hacks, not something we specify for this purpose. Anyway,
So right now, like with sidecars, there's like 5 different implementations of not built-in Istio multi-cluster, and 5 different approaches.
Yeah.
So there's no standard way to do it. And if you go and make this is the standard way to extend Istio for multi-cluster, like 4 of them are going to be unhappy, and the other one's going to be wondering, what? Probably all 5 will be unhappy. Like I don't get it. We have APIs. It's not like Kubernetes says you must use services that are named foo-version. Like it has a service API, and you can do whatever the hell you want with it.
I would say that like the intent that I think I share with Costin is to try to reduce the footprint of this so that we can have like a known, well-tested core logic, and then be able to be extensible on the how do we fill in the details of getting the specific information, and that could it could be push, pull, different whatever model there, but without yes, obviously trying to avoid the same situation that we have with Sidecar, where there's 5 different implementations that are entirely different. And yes, it's possible that you can glue up all of these various extension points. I'm hoping that we can avoid that and instead have 2/3 of the implementation centralized and common interfaces for interacting with that, and be able to just fill the data into there by potentially 2 different means. One of which is the existing one that we're planning to ship with open source Istio.
It sounds like what is being asked for is an implementer's guide for how to use the primitives the same way that the built-in in Istio would use them. And for Istio to document this, how it uses the set of primitives to achieve that effect, right? That's really an implementer's guide.
Or bringing an interface layer one step above those primitives.
I think that exists.
We already have the primitives, right? Plus or minus a few details probably, but let's all share the same knowledge that we have the primitives today, mostly. There are other things that you can do, as John has mentioned, to achieve similar effects. And then there's what the built-in mechanism will use, right? And it should use the primitives we think should be used in the way we think it should be used. Then, okay, where does Istio's responsibility stop, right? And the implementer's responsibility start, right? Istio will ship a reference implementation in open source that implementers can all read. It documents the API and extension points that are being used in that implementation. Those APIs, because they're public APIs in Istio, are stable, right? We can write a guide saying, here's how you build your own multi-cluster controller. But at some point, we're going to stop, right? We're not going to do things, right? Where is that line? Costin, and Mike, I guess you have to decide where you're comfortable with that line being drawn.
I'm very flexible. I mean, it's as long. I mean, what I don't want is the 5 different ways that are completely untested and are not documented. If we have one, pretty much any of them I'm happy with it.
Okay, so if Istio ships one and uses the extension points that it's already declared, so that would be by definition supported, right?
Yeah, no. One thing I want to clarify here is it's not specific to Google clusters that have this kind of requirements around authentication and other things. It's a very common problem. So it may be desirable for open source Istio to have a mechanism that say, hey, if you cannot get long-lived secrets that are you can store in all clusters for whatever reasons, here is an alternative where you create these objects with a script CI/CD. It doesn't have to be something that you can manually set up multi-cluster because it's not you're not going to change every day the other clusters and the remote gateways. So you can still work and support all the features even in situations where you don't have ability to spread secrets.
So you're asking for documentation, Costa. Right?
Documentation pretty much because this probably doesn't need anything else. I mean, if you have documentation, this can be done manually. You have 10 clusters, it's not a big deal to create 10 resources and replicate them.
So today we have primitives, workload entry, service entry. They're documented. Happy to document them better. We have the remote gateway thing. There's all these things that you can build together to do whatever you want. Who are we trying to solve for? Is it an end user, or is it Mike and Costin?
End user who cannot use secrets.
And we're going to tell them to go manually.
You have 10 clusters. What a big deal to create 10 resources and replicate.
It's not 10 resources.
It's not
just
just 10
resources.
That's the problem. Like, it's outside of the remote gateways. Like, the remote gateways is necessary but not sufficient for an implementation that does not read remote control planes. Like, you need pods, you need endpoints, you need for at the very least for service accounts and secure naming. There's other things in Istio that will break if you don't have those things. So the only question in my mind is, does Istio have enough extensibility to be able to provide those without reading remote clusters? And I think there's what we can do there. Like, MCP, meth config protocol over XDS is a thing that exists. We can, if there's anything missing from it, we can extend it. Like, there's things we can do, but I don't know that that's this conversation. The controller that reads the remote cluster is separate from the thing that computes the XDS. There's actually several layers within it. It's actually fairly complicated. But like, as long as if we want to talk about building another place to push that information or to pull that information in a different way, that's a separate conversation in my mind than what we're discussing here.
That I think that might be helpful to clarify that then, because if that's the case and that we're comfortable with that and with the existing primitives, I think we should just make that explicit.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the way I view it is, today you can make Istio multi-cluster without doing secret sharing and cross things. Even with ambient today, you could do it. And in order to do that, you have to do a lot of work. And probably you would have a separate controller or something doing that work. This is about building that into Istio first class, like we have with sidecars.
Or documenting it.
So if we don't do that, then we would have to say on our docs, multi-cluster is available, go to Azure, go to GKE, go to Glue.
Yep.
I'm sure there'd be an open source one, but
yeah, no, that's reasonable. And I think just trying to get this like upfront, like for implementers of like, what are the interfaces that this is using? What is necessary to plumb through? What's the data that we need? So yeah, I guess maybe to Louis' point, like what I'm asking for is a bit more of an implementer's guide, just to make sure that the proposed open source implementation is not reliant on undocumented APIs or shortcuts that are not possible for alternative implementation.
Let's say implementer's guide that will be used by users until an open source or implementation exists, because a user that doesn't have capability to do remote watch will probably need to also follow the guide. Now, one thing that Kit said, which is actually very important, is that right now we have a lot of hidden things that Istio is doing, including the service account watching and trying to discover service account, and which is again very tricky because especially since we're the east-west acting as a waypoint and the security may be different. So that's exactly the reason I think it's a very important problem to solve, because it will force us to find ways to maybe simplify this. Maybe we don't have to watch all the endpoints. We don't care about the endpoints in the remote cluster if you are going to a gateway that has already that information. The service accounts on the other side, that's one reason you may not want to use the current multi-cluster implementation, because again, you may want to have control over what remote identity is instead of having it guessed by and kind of relatively insecure, because if you don't trust completely the cluster on the other side, you may not trust it to give you the list of service accounts and other things because it's under different administrative control. So this kind of stuff, where if we document it, we may be able to simplify it and to remove things that are perhaps not necessary.
So two things I'd like to say. First, in response to what you said, Costin, like, sure, there's some probably variability in the amount of information needed to achieve certain effects, right? If you're peering things that are in different organizational domains, they're not the same thing, right? Then there's the other case where they are replicas of each other and they are the same thing, right? And that's actually very common. So there's details there. The other point I'd like to make is the best way to qualify this is to build the reference implementation, right? So I don't want to put the cart before the horse here, right? We will figure out some of the limitations of the extension points and their ability to be used by having the reference implementation in open source. I don't want to go the other way around, right?
That's fair.
So it's actually more important that Istio, or at least that qualifying process is gone through and we establish whether certain things are needed or not needed to achieve a reasonable effect. And then we can add the layer of standardization, not the other way around, right? We shouldn't try and do that.
Just to put a exclamation point on that, Louis, like even just in starting the implementation of the data plane piece, that has informed some of the changes I've made to the control plane doc, because it's like, oh, we need these extra pieces. One of the, to Costin's point about verifying pod identity, the inner tunnel for double H-bone has to know, like, at least has to have some verification of what that final destination endpoint's identity is, because we're doing double encapsulation. The outer layer looks at the gateway identity, inner layer looks at your remote pod identity. Maybe that's not a trade-off that we like, right? Maybe as we built this out, we realized we want to add a different mode that doesn't require that. Maybe that's too burdensome on users. Maybe the performance of double H-bone is too burdensome. We won't know until we build it.
Isn't it gateway and then waypoint?
If there's a waypoint, we don't know if there's a waypoint yet. You have to be able to support both.
Yeah, the other thing I just want to call out too is that Istio multi-cluster supports flat and multi-network mode, which is part of, well, at least I've been attempting to steer this document towards. Whereas an extension may pick one or the other, for example, and it may behave quite differently depending on if it just supports one or the other, because it can specialize on just that thing, right? So I don't want to go too far down the route of hyper-specializing multi-network in the open source implementation, and then we realize, oh shit, we have to rewrite everything we just did because we didn't consider this single flat network use case.
That's a good point. So basically, the design of this document should also enable single network, right? So that we don't have to redo this if somebody later choose to add single network support for multi-cluster.
I don't know that I'd go quite that far. Like I think that this document needs to not preclude single network. It doesn't need to break single network. It needs to fit smoothly for single network. But I don't know that it needs. I don't know that once this doc is implemented, single network just works. I think there are other questions, especially around waypoint logic and things like that. That's my point of view, personally.
I mean, I think it should just work. It may not be optimal, but it should work. There
are maybe. I think again, waypoint specifically throw a bit of a wrench into it, because now as a client tunnel one cluster could send to a remote waypoint in a different cluster. That's a decision we didn't make in the protocol doc because we weren't targeting that in the protocol doc. So just generally in the same direction as what you're saying, Mike and Lynn, but there are some details that would need to be figured out and decided upon. For security reasons, I don't know that we necessarily want to advertise single network support until we answer those questions.
But just as my curiosity, Do people agree that having the secrets with relatively high permission spread all over, not rotated, is a good security posture, or something that security-oriented product is comfortable to say that it's a best practice? Or I'm the only one who's a bit paranoid?
What high permissions are you referring to? Can you clarify?
So we basically take a secret from each cluster with all the Istio remote permissions, which are watching pretty much everything. Secrets, I hope we remove them, but I don't remember. At some point we had them. And have this secret that doesn't rotate, which is a long-lived secret, spread in all clusters, no matter how trusted they are. So if one cluster is compromised, basically you have access to all the other clusters with relatively high things, and with a secret that is not rotated, which is kind of we do MTLS and all the other fancy stuff, but we rely on a long-lived secret spread everywhere.
In
The
the
read-only
level of
permissions.
in the level of security crimes, well, they're not always read-only, Keith. I think sometimes have write permission.
I think
It's your reader service account, from what I last checked.
Yeah,
I
the
thought we had
only
write for workload things.
no.
what point had secret read?
Anyway.
It was pretty much
Okay. Never mind. In the list of security crimes, right, distributing keys is something that enterprises do all the time and are quite used to it. Is it great? No. Do they buy products to shield key access? Yes. Do all of them do it? No. Right? So there's a lot of users who don't care, Costin, from a security standpoint. And then there are some users who do, like everything else in security.
For people who care about security, I mean, and use Istio because they care about security, they may be a bit, kind of surprised that we claim that MTLS is the best because you don't have to have shared secrets. But at the same time, I don't know, that was just, if everyone is comfortable with it and it's documented clearly that, hey, our multi-clusters rely on the secret and people know what to expect, because it's kind of hidden, we don't say explicitly, hey, expect that you'll have some long-lived secrets that have those permissions and you are comfortable with it.
I mean, no matter what, like if I wrote an MCS controller, it has to connect to the other clusters, right?
But you can run it in a dedicated cluster. You don't spread the secrets in all clusters. If you have a cluster in Russia, you probably, are not going to run the controller in Russia.
You can also run
Our
Istio that way too. That's
Yep, you can do Istio remote or Istio remote helm chart or external helm chart. That's totally possible.
Like our job is to give people the options, right? So one can use the options, and not all the alternatives are so great either. Like last I saw, MCS on GK supports like 10 services or something, right? You have to make your trade-offs.
But you can have an Istio D that runs in one secure cluster in a secure zone that is not, and that is creating the resources everywhere. It's not really impossible to do it. I mean, we don't have options really. We just have one option, and we are saying
like John said, like we have a way to partition the trust domain from the control plane domain that is perfectly valid, right? And gives people a lot of topological control. The downside, of course, is most people don't want that, right? Or they don't want to go to the additional effort and work to get that enhanced security posture. Now, as a vendor, Costin, you are more than welcome to do that on their behalf, right? And clearly you have the capability to do it. There's an upper band to how much Istio should do. Now, whether we're saying what Istio does by default is good, we can have a debate about that. But is it untenable? I think it's clearly not untenable.
No, I'm not saying untenable. I'm just saying that is perhaps not documented enough for people to make informed choices and know what they are getting into. And yeah,
I don't think anybody's ever going to argue with the could we document better thing. No, like that's just a default in any meeting that we have at this point.
My overall view is that like there's no perfect solution. Everything is trade-offs, big trade-offs. And Istio today offers you the ability to make all those any trade-off you want. It's very flexible, both what you can do with just pure core and what you can extend. And I think that's a really good property. I don't want to have a couple people decide these are the trade-offs I like and then hyper fixate on that and lose out on that flexibility.
Completely agree. And that's exactly what I've been asking to have options. I mean, if you implement multi-cluster, to have the option documented somewhere, one of the 5, that someone could follow and not rely on this. As long as we have the option, even if it's manual, I'm happy.
Okay. I will take a note as we work through this on building an implementer's guide. Like I think a couple years ago, I started the whole idea of the architecture docs thing, and I've liked those in Istio, and I as part of this, I think we should. I plan to create more of those on what these primitives are, what the requirements are, and I think that's the right place for an implementer's guide is the architecture document for all these pieces. Really quickly, since I know we've got other topics, I only want to spend maybe 2 or 3 more minutes on this. At this point, I'm just going to point out things I'd love for reviewers to take a look at. Mainly at a high level, new additions added a WDS contract as far as what the workload is going to look like for the East-West Gateway. Big thing here is that there is going to be a network gateway field with the IP of specific East-West Gateway. You could also have a service of the East-West for the East-West Gateway. There's no IP on this workload, et cetera, et cetera. We will use the upstream SANs, I think the field is, on the service resource in WDS in order to kind of plumb through what the set of SANs we expect from the remote cluster to look like. Again, because the zTunnel client doesn't see any specific endpoint / workloads from the remote cluster, we need to use service to tell zTunnel what all the SANs that we're going to be expecting. Another thing here is the East-West Gateway implementation. For a little bit, initially I was thinking, we could sort of defer the conversation on whether to use like the existing East-West Gateway out support for that versus creating a new East-West Gateway implementation. Took a look at what that implementation will look like. I don't like it. It feels gross. So my proposal here is that we add a Gateway API instantiation for creating a new East-West Gateway, the new Gateway class. Down, I see that new Gateway class Istio East-West down here. TLS protocol, or the protocol for listener will be HBone. The TLS will be terminate. That's all double HBone really is. And then users will expose their services by labeling them with the Istio IO/export label. I think it makes sense to also expand this to apply the namespace for exposing a namespace of services via that gateway. I need to clarify this a little bit in the text as I'm looking at it now, but this is meant to really be the same implementation as a waypoint, where you've got the services with a use waypoint label, but just with different labels. And so I anticipate that we'll be able to reuse a decent bit of the code for waypoint selection here. So that is the long and short of the doc. Please review async and let me know if you have questions. Costin, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe we should clarify in that gateway what is part that Istio is requiring when it's watching for them. I mean, is it a class? Is it a protocol HBone? If I create a different class with the HBone protocol, it will be watched. It's kind of the same concept as earlier.
What Istio-D will read and interpret as an East-West Gateway will be that Istio East-West Gateway class. We already have a gateway class environment variable for the defaults gateway API implementation, as well as I think the waypoint implementation. So I imagine we could add a similar environment variable for if you have a custom gateway class that will be interpreted as an East-West Gateway.
Or a list of, yeah. Okay, awesome.
Mitch?
Is there a reason that we're using like layer 7 gateways rather than just zTunnel layer 4 as East-West?
HBone is the layer 7 protocol. It's HTTP, yes.
Well, zTunnel it's just terminating and then forwarding, which zTunnel already does. That's a fair point. I do think that the exposing a service via a gateway pattern is already done in waypoint, so it made more sense to me to just do it there. Most of the logic is like already exists. To make it the zTunnel East-West Gateway, first of all, you would have to you'd be creating a service in front of a daemon set, a load balancer service in front of a daemon set, which feels sort of strange. And then the zTunnel would have to, it wouldn't be in pod either. It would be like a separate proxy processing mode, which yeah, there's a. I feel like when you look at the details there and you break it down, it gets sort of weird to think about. Are you saying use the existing Z tunnel or deploy a separate Z tunnel?
Yeah, sorry, I had missed this section of the document. When you and I discussed it in November, we had talked about reusing the Z tunnel to act as the east-west gateway. So I was a little bit caught off guard here. Because all it's doing is terminating and forwarding HBone, right? It's not doing any layer 7 abstractions, path checking, outlier detection, etc. is not happening here.
It could
Well,
do.
if
That's
you
a
want
point.
health checking is something I think for optimization would be actually really beneficial for the gateway to do. The other issue with reusing the existing Z tunnel is that, again, I don't love the idea of putting a load balancer service in front of a daemon set. Like you can't scale with load. And you can't just do a node port service because then the node would have to be externally routable. So we can discuss a bit more on that, and I can understand what you're thinking about specifically.
Happy to take that offline. Thanks.
And if you are short on IPs, you may use a gateway for multiple purposes. And many people are short on public IPs. Or they pay for them.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend that you make the Z tunnel port or like put a public IP per Z tunnel instance. You'd want a load balancer in front of them. But anyways, we can discuss that offline.
Sorry for all the time, but I cede the floor back to Lynn, I think.
All right, thank you, Keith. I think we have a couple of other topics. I'm not sure if we have time to get through everything. Ben, you're up next.
Yeah, looking for a view on the ambient IP tables reconciliation stuff. This is currently proposed to be in 1.2.5 so that we can mitigate the DNS issue for people that upgrade, and also get some people to try to kick the tires on it. And then in a couple of releases, we will turn it on by default. I've updated the PR so that if people are looking at the release notes and don't want to restart their pods after they upgrade, then I mentioned that this is another thing that they may do. They can install with this option and then not have to do that, so we can get some people to try it. Just looking for reviews on getting that in, and that's pretty much it. In time for 1.25, which is, pending.
Awesome. Anyone have any questions for Ben? I guess this is a nice feature for users to have. All right, let's move on to our favorite topic, authorization policy. Yeah.
Yeah. So we discussed it last time, a couple options. I think I misread the room a little bit, and I ended up putting out an implementation to try binding policy to the gateway class. So that PR exists. I will link it in the notes here shortly. It does require a change to the API. That's under review as well.
The API validation, not the surface.
Yes,
right.
it's a change in the API repo, but it's just removing some cell validation that would reject it if you put a gateway class in. Like at that layer, there's still validation in the webhook. So if you choose to do extension beyond what Istio offers, you got to extend the webhook as well. But that's a lot easier than making the user install a new CRD to extend. So this is a good call out. Thank you.
Can you link the PR you need approval? Sounds like you need multiple approval for the API change. Is that right?
Yep, I will. I'll link them in right now.
Okay, and then there's a comment. I don't know if this person is even here from Neil. He said follow up on D-line at layer 4, even if targeted at a waypoint. So I assume that comment is a follow-up from what we discussed last time. Well, waypoint should be able to honor deny by default, even if that policy is a layer 4 policy.
I think that was still a controversial, or that was not necessarily a fully consensus-based approach. I think there was consensus for what Ian did, which is why he did it first, I think. I don't know if we'll, like, anything else is really achievable in the 1.2.5 timeline. We can obviously continue the conversation for future releases.
Okay, so not necessarily have any action on that at the moment.
Yeah, then the follow would be like, let's schedule some more discussion in this meeting.
Yeah, that sounds good. Evan, I think, should we wrap this topic up actually? Ian, do you have anything else?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess I'll just note, I think it would be nice to get it into 125. It shouldn't do anything unless the user opts into it, so it shouldn't be a big change or risk. But yeah, I'm happy to have that discussion in the pull request if folks disagree. So,
John, what about the other PR? The implement the deny by default L4 check inside the waypoint. What is the status on that?
One thing just to clarify, nothing that I've done at least, or that I think is like deny by default. It's just to implement L4 policy at the waypoint.
Right.
In terms of that, I have a POC PR, but I haven't made it beyond a POC.
So likelihood for 1.2.5 timeline.
I mean, off by default, we could do it. It would take me, I don't know, a couple hours to clean it up, and we'd have to backport it probably. I think the branch cut's going to happen within the next hour or two. But
Do we think it's urgent to back it to 1.2.5?
I don't think it has to be in 1.2.5.0. It could be backported into 1.2.5.1.
I mean, we still have time to 1.2.5.0 too, right? It's just a branch.
Right. The only thing is obviously John's change does introduce production risk, right?
But it's off by default, right?
Right. No, it has to be off by default, which is why it's back. It can go into a patch release. It doesn't have to be in 1.2.5 because it's trying to address a bug, or we can decide not to do that. I think we have more flexibility there. It's up to John if you want to get the work done or not for the 1.25. I don't think, because Ian's change is the more important one, I think, functionally. John's change is really fixing a logical bug, but that fixing it introduces some risk, so we have to put it behind a flag. But users can achieve the effect via Ian's, right? At least the majority of what John is doing by Ian's effect to achieve deny by default. Implementing all of the L4 policy, right? You still we want that over time, right? And we do want to fix that. But I don't think it's essential that it ships in 1.2.5.0. I do think it's essential that Ian's does.
I think
so. I would say John's his best effort in the release.
The only, like, I guess, partial counter I would say to that is that I think John's is effective at the namespace scope.
Yeah.
And the one that I've done is only like global scope. We're not going to let someone bind to a gateway class outside of the root namespace, at least not at first. So.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, John. I guess yours is slightly more than nice to have then in the release.
Of course, yeah. Because I don't even know if that user was using default by deny and namespace or cluster-wide. I'd imagine people probably will start with namespace level, especially if they're new to ambient.
I think a lot of people actually do use cluster-wide.
I wouldn't be surprised.
There's some people.
I'm
sure there's some people using per namespace as well, right? And if you're starting in an allow by default state, you can't just go to deny by default,
right?
Without writing a bunch of policies. But people do want to get to deny by default, and some certainly have.
Yeah, especially when they transition to this D9 by default for all the cluster. Yeah.
But if they start a new cluster, they may start it in D9 by default, obviously.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's usually when they're replicating existing clusters and applications and policies, right, Costin? So it's really the authorship of the policy that matters here, not because they're just copying clusters. Some, like in very paranoid places where you're starting developing and you have nothing yet, yes, you may start by deny by default. Like a lot of people don't, right? Because they have existing stuff. And I see your note, Ben, and I agree. So we could probably wrap that up.
Yeah, I think we had enough discussion on OSCE policy. So, Evan, are you still here? Sorry, it took so long to get through.
Yep, I'm here. No idea how long it'll take. I'm happy to join next week as well if that's better. I'll defer to you all on if you want to try to squeeze it in or on.
Maybe you have it kicked off, and if not enough time, you'll be the first on the next week.
Sure. So my name's Evan Gilman. I'm a maintainer on the Spiffy Inspire projects. We have a lot of folks using them today in conjunction with Istio. Usually these are deployments where Spire is deployed like across a very broad set of heterogeneous infrastructure, and Istio being part of that. We've got quite a few of those adopters also asking us how to use ambient mode. I've poked around some of the open issues, talked to some folks in the community, and I'm getting like a lot of mixed signals on like, okay, does upstream ambient want this kind of an integration point, or do they not want this kind of an integration point? So that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out here. I have confidence that if it's a resourcing thing, right? Like I have confidence that we can drum up some resources to make that contribution. But number one, like, is it even a thing on the roadmap that y'all would accept? Number two, like, you know, give me some pointers on like where I can direct some energy to get things started and rolling. And so that's like the conversation I wanted to open today.
Well, Evan, you and I have talked about this before. I'll just say my part here is like, I think more integration is better. So if we can provide, you know, better security guarantees through integration with Spire for our users, it seems like a win for Spire users and a win for Istio users. So happy to see some movement there.
And I always say 2 implementations is always better than one for any contract and API and protocol.
I would somewhat push back on both of those. The end result of more integrations is better for users because it means they can use our stuff with their stuff. But we do need to be careful about the integration points we offer. Today in sidecars, we have like 10 different CA integration points. It's way too many. And it's really complicated, like insanely complicated. That's not good. I mean, it's good in some ways because there's always a way to integrate your CA. But I think it's a lot too many. So like, we've had this issue on zTunnel in the past, which we haven't talked about in a long time. But of like, what is the smallest set of integration points such that we can get the largest set of integrations? That I think is important to keep in mind. Like, for example, I think Spire is pretty much the only implementation of the Spiffy API. So like to Costin's point, it's not necessarily the most like universal, you know, API. There's not really a de facto standard. Like in metrics, it's a lot easier. For example, you have OTLP or Prometheus metrics, and from there you get everything basically. The CA story I find is a lot less standardized. So I'm not saying I'm against Spire necessarily. I just don't want to say like, sure, open the floodgates, Spire, your proprietary API, Google, CAS, you know, all these different things.
John, maybe, I mean, what you said earlier, there are 5 ways to do it in with sidecars. One of them is UDS sockets that we support. I don't see any reason to invent a new one, but maybe we can keep supporting the UDS sockets that we have because it has the capability, I believe, to do pretty much what we need now to kind of generate zTunnel to get certificates with different SANs based on a policy on the CA side, which in case of Spire will be local or some other implementations. Yeah, I agree. Not all 5, but at least 1 local, so we don't have to depend on central CA, and 1 would not be so bad.
I just need to hop in here and say, like, it's not as simple as a Unix domain socket. Like, what's the API? What is the thing that we're going to be requesting here? Especially with ZTONs is even more critical than Sidecar, because ZTONs is requesting permission, a identity on behalf of the workload. So just pushing back gently on that, I do think that, I linked to Issue that Spiffy as a standard is looking to target a delegated identity sort of API. I think that makes perfect sense for Istio to target. I think Kubernetes CSR is another really good option as well. That is standard. You can integrate things like with like Cert Manager, which is really popular. I would even say at this point, Kubernetes CSR over Cert Manager, now that Cert Manager has support for it. Like I think between Istio, CA, API, Spiffy delegated identity standard, and Kube CSR, that's a really wide array of CA support that we'd be providing for ourselves, just as a starting point.
Evan, so it's kind of like, let's survey the CA landscape and let's pick not all integration points, but a reasonable set of surfaces that are going to yield a high probability of meeting most users' use case. Can you talk about the current state of standards in this universe? Because I'm probably extremely out of date, and this is not what this group talks about all the time. John's concern is reasonable, and we don't want a limitless integration points. Keith gave arguments for 2 plus, I guess. So could you talk about the universe right now?
Yes. Some of those things, a handful of those things mentioned are Kubernetes specific. Obviously, it is a goal of Spiffy to be platform agnostic. It's why we see these deployments span not just Istio, but also other parts of the environment. Spiffy, I'm biased. Spiffy, in my opinion, is the de facto set of standards for issuing workload identity, also providing CA certificates in that context. We can see the industry moving around this, right? We've seen Microsoft and Google kind of coalesce around those set of standards. We also now see uptake of those standards in the IETF and a new working group called WMSI, which is focused specifically on these areas. The workload API, which is what Sidecar is used to do, well, this SDS API is actually reflected. Everything that is not Istio Envoy would use the workload API. Spire happens to serve the SDS API side by side. There is a separate API called Delegated Identity API, which is a Spire-ism. That is true. We have seen the need for this kind of an API, this delegated API, across more than just ambient mode. Cilium as a consumer. We also have CSI type patterns that fit this, internal platforms that people build that fit this. And so there is an active effort as linked in Spiffy to standardize an API that is specifically for these kinds of consumers, these platform level delegated consumers. So that is the second part of the conversation. I think that is what makes sense for Istio to look at in ambient mode rather than this Spire-ism. The shape is likely to change. But the long story short here is that these things aren't going anywhere. There are multiple implementations. Spire is one. My company has a commercial implementation of this stuff as well. And with IETF, WMSI pointing at Spiffy as the workload identity standard and actually talking about new standards in that area, but all kind of anchored on Spiffy. I think it's pretty safe to say that, number one, you can tuck multiple implementations behind that interface, and number two, that interface doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, so your expectation is that delegated workload identity interface will become an actual standard?
Yes, and I'm personally pushing on that, and I see that happening. And that now is actually the perfect time for us to say, like, hey, let's work with zTunnel, let's work with Cilium, let's work with a couple of these others that we know have this pattern to make sure that the interface is something that is ergonomic.
And then the CSI pattern, right? So just, Mitch, allow me, if you will. That was to basically materialize in a mounted file system a managed and rotated certificate or set of certificates and keys, potentially, that could be consumed purely through the file system interface.
That's one way you could implement it.
Right. Which is obviously, the lowest common denominator approach is give things a set of paths and tell it to read them and pull them. I know there's wide variability in vendor support for that pattern. right? Like the CAs that you implement may do it. You know, I could probably name 5 other CAs that don't and are unlikely to. Do you think that is actually a practical standard base for people to target, or do you think that that's really just going to end up, like, we may end up having to support it anyway because it's the lowest common denominator for things, but it's not practical for actual enterprise use cases?
Yeah, I think that there's some religious, philosophical arguments in there. Like for the purposes of this conversation, and the standardized delegated identity API interface is actually, this is one step removed. So, Spiffy would implement this delegated identity API that allows a trustworthy platform component operating within the scope of the node to obtain credentials on behalf of other workloads on the node. What that thing chooses to do with those credentials, whether it drops them on a disk for that thing, whether it turns around and it pops up another UDS socket, is kind of out of scope for that standards work.
Okay, so we don't actually expect CSI to become a standard per se.
Not within Spiffy today. So like what I would imagine is, hey, zTunnel is growing a client for this standardized API. It knows how to attach to a Spiffy implementation that serves that standardized API. zTunnel might choose to not drop those things anywhere. It might choose to utilize those credentials directly, right? Or you can build another piece that attaches and drops them, or you can do whatever you want.
Quick question. So I agree, per node agent that is trusted and can issue certificates with own policy is good. The interface is a concern that we have, and I think there are 2 in sidecars. One is the UDS socket, the other one is the file system. You seem to prefer the file system. I don't have major objections, but I am trying to understand how you are going to send the request to the CA, local CA, to issue the certificate in the file system.
I don't think he was saying that, Dustin. I think he was
Maybe I
saying
misunderstood. He said
the limits of the standard are to create the API. People may create CSI bindings on top as third parties,
right?
To do file system map.
So zTunnel will do what? When zTunnel needs a certificate, will do what? Send a message on a socket or create a file, or what? What's your proposal?
It will call the API.
Which API?
The delegated identity one that's in the chat.
It's a delegated. Okay, I get it.
I apologize. I am late for an important call. Maybe
okay, yeah.
By next week.
Let's sync up for next week.
Yeah, let's wrap this up for next time.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.